Welcome to the research desk.
Imagine it is 1913. You walk into an art gallery in Munich.
Right, and instead of a serene landscape or, a bowl of fruit or a portrait of some wealthy aristocrat, you are confronted by a massive, chaotic storm of clashing colors and jagged lines.
And you turn to the painter and you ask, what on earth you are looking at?
And they tell you, it's a symphony. We are looking at a historical and aesthetic puzzle today that has fascinated critics, historians, and, basically anyone who has ever stood in front of a modern canvas and wondered how they're supposed to look at it.
It is the central tension of modernism. Why does abstract art so frequently and honestly so comfortably borrow the vocabulary of music?
Exactly. We use words like rhythm, harmony, dissonance, tension, and release to describe silent, stationary objects hanging on a wall. When painting lost its centuries-old job of documenting reality to the invention of photography, this profound void opened up.
So the question is, did painting simply borrow music's instruction manual to learn how to mean something without representing anything?
I will argue that music was the explicit catalytic model for abstraction. Music had already solved the problem of non-representative meaning long before painters even realized they had a problem. It offered visual artists a proven prototype, a living, breathing proof that form alone could carry immense emotional and structural significance.
And I am going to stress test that narrative. The idea that music was the secret, singular origin of abstract art is a beautifully convenient narrative. It is elegant, it is romantic, but, it is also a seductive overreach.
An overreach?
Absolutely. Elevating music to the status of the primary engine of abstraction ignores the immense complexity of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Abstraction didn't spring from a single source. It emerged through several independent, culturally wide routes.
Ranging from what to what?
Ranging from the hard physics of the era, to spiritual radicalism, to global visual traditions that had mastered non-mimetic expression centuries earlier. Music didn't birth abstract art. Music merely helped illuminate a destination that visual artists were already marching toward from a dozen different directions.
Well, let's step back into the crisis that defined the late 19th century, just to understand why visual artists were marching anywhere to begin with. We have to unpack the sheer existential panic that the rise of photography induced in the world of painting.
It really was an extinction-level event for a specific type of labor.
Completely. Think about what painting was for centuries before 1839. Its primary social and economic utility was mimetic, mimesis, the imitation of reality. You were essentially a recording device.
If a king wanted to project power, he commissioned a portrait. If a church wanted to instill the fear of God, they commissioned a vast fresco of the apocalypse.
Right. Or, if you just wanted to remember what your grandmother looked like, you hired a miniaturist. Thousands of working artists paid their rent by acting as human photocopiers.
And then Louis Daguerre steps onto the stage.
He publicly introduces the daguerreotype in Paris, exposing an image onto a silver-plated sheet of copper. And almost overnight, the entire economic foundation of the visual arts is obliterated.
Because why pay a painter to sit for weeks to capture a flawed, subjective likeness when a chemical process can capture reality perfectly?
Perfectly, flawlessly, and in a fraction of the time, the mimetic bargain was broken. Painters were suddenly unmoored. They were freed from the burden of documentation, sure, but they were utterly devoid of a new positive program. This is the crisis of representation.
They had to figure out how to justify their own existence.
So where do you turn when you must abandon imitation but still want to create profound art? You turn to the symphony. Consider what a symphony actually is within the cultural hierarchy of the 19th century.
It is the peak of high culture.
Exactly. And yet, it doesn't need to depict a tree. It doesn't need to show us a human face. It doesn't illustrate a specific historical event. Yet, sitting in a concert hall, it moves the listener to tears, to terror, to joy.
It achieves all of that through abstract mechanics.
It does this entirely through pure relations. It relies on the mathematical intervals between notes, the rhythm of a snare, the tempo of the strings, the careful management of tension and crescendo. It is entirely abstract, yet undeniably meaningful.
So you're arguing that painters looked at composers and saw a way out.
I am arguing that music gave painting something incredibly precious in this era of crisis: music as permission. It proved that an artwork could be built entirely from internal relations rather than external subjects, and still be taken seriously by the culture at large. It demonstrated that abandoning the object didn't mean abandoning meaning.
You were making it sound like music was the only lifeboat available to a drowning discipline, which is exactly where the narrative breaks down for me.
How so?
Well, the story you just told is perfectly structured. It has a villain, which is the camera, it has a crisis of faith, and it has a savior, which is music. But historical reality is never that neat. I view the music origin story like a beautifully crafted clock.
A clock?
Yes, you can admire a clock's intricate gears, its polished brass, its flawless sweeping hands, and you can become so captivated by its elegant design that you mistake the machinery for the actual physics of timekeeping.
That is a harsh analogy.
But an accurate one. The clock measures time. It does not create it. Music offered painters a vocabulary, yes, but it was not the sole cause of their migration into abstraction. While portrait painters were looking at their canvases and wondering what to do next, we have to look at the massive epistemic revolution happening concurrently.
You mean outside of the arts?
Completely outside the arts. The entire fabric of human knowledge was shifting away from the observable surface of things. Let's look at physics. For hundreds of years, classical mechanics ruled. Newtonian physics.
Things you could drop, push, or observe with the naked eye.
Right. But right at the turn of the 20th century, physics plunges into the invisible. We start talking about electromagnetism, subatomic particles, quantum states. The discipline abandons things you can touch in favor of mathematical models of unseen forces.
And you see this happening across other disciplines as well.
The exact same thing happens in economics. We move away from descriptive, moral philosophy about human behavior and start relying on statistical aggregates, demographic models, abstract graphs. Society at large was undergoing a massive rewiring.
So you're saying the zeitgeist was just generally moving toward the abstract?
Culture was learning to trust patterns over depictions. They were realizing that the deepest truths of the universe couldn't be drawn or photographed. They had to be modeled. Painting becoming abstract was simply one expression of this broader modern faith in underlying structure. To say painting learned this purely from music is to ignore the intellectual atmosphere both of them were breathing.
Hold on, let me stop you there. Your point about physics and economics expanding the cultural imagination is valid, but it remains entirely theoretical.
I wouldn't call quantum mechanics merely theoretical in its cultural impact.
But if we look at the timeline and examine the actual documented working methods of the artists who forced this transition, the transition from theory to specific historical output places music firmly at the wheel. Let's examine Wassily Kandinsky.
1913.
1913. He paints Composition 7. This is widely regarded as one of the first great landmarks of pure abstraction. It is a vast, swirling storm of color and line. There is no horizon line. There are no figures.
It is pure chaos, visually speaking, to a 19th century eye.
Kandinsky didn't just quietly borrow a musical term. He literally titled his paintings Compositions and Improvisations. And this wasn't just a clever branding exercise. He was deeply invested in his own synesthetic imagination.
Synesthesia being the crossing of the sensory wires?
Exactly. He experienced a neurological crossing of wires where he literally heard color and saw sound. A trumpet physically looked yellow to him. A cello manifested as a deep blue. He used this biological reality to bridge the gap between auditory and visual abstraction.
He did write about that extensively in Concerning the Spiritual in Art.
He wrote a whole manifesto on it. If harmony and dissonance can structure how we listen, if a diminished chord creates a feeling of unease that demands a sonic resolution, why couldn't those exact same principles structure how we see? He was actively using the established rules of musical composition to solve the terror of the blank canvas. He wasn't looking at quantum physics equations or economic statistics in his studio. He was looking at a musical score.
Kandinsky is a phenomenal example for your case, but he is also a neurological outlier.
An outlier who changed the course of art history.
Kandinsky's synesthesia was an incredible personal phenomenon, and Composition 7 is an undeniable masterpiece. But if music were the single necessary pipeline to abstraction, then every subsequent abstract breakthrough should carry that same musical DNA.
Meaning they should all look like symphonies.
It should naturally follow Kandinsky's logic. But just 2 years later, in 1915, Kazimir Malevich exhibits Black Square in Petrograd. Let's contrast these two works profoundly, because the distance between them destroys the pipeline theory.
Well, Composition 7 is an orchestral surge. It is loud, it is dense, it is filled with overlapping harmonies and visual crescendos.
And Malevich's Black Square is none of those things. It is exactly what the title says. It is a stark, flat black geometric square painted on a slightly off-white canvas.
Displayed in a very specific way, too.
Yes, it was hung high up in the corner of the room, exactly where a traditional Russian Orthodox icon would be placed in a home. It is a total reduction. Malevich wiped the slate clean. He wasn't trying to paint a symphony.
He was trying to paint nothingness.
He was trying to reach what he called the metaphysical zero of painting, the pure artistic feeling devoid of all context. He wanted to zero out the material world completely. Black Square feels entirely divorced from Kandinsky's logic.
It is definitely not a musical composition.
It is born of spiritual radicalism, of philosophical negation, of a desire to find the absolute absolute. If music was the master key, Malevich wouldn't have been able to unlock the door. Art history is not a pipeline where one idea flows neatly into the next. It is a delta. The waters of abstraction arrived at the ocean through countless different, diverging rivers.
Malevich is the ultimate minimalist extreme, sure. But if you think his Black Square killed the musical analogy, you are ignoring what happened when painters had to figure out how to arrange multiple shapes on a canvas again.
Once you hit zero, you have to start counting up again.
Exactly. Let's move the timeline forward to the 1940s and test this theory against the spatial realities of painting. The musical analogy not only survives Malevich's mimation, it becomes the dominant operating system of modern art. Let's look at Piet Mondrian.
Mondrian in his New York period.
Yes. Mondrian flees a war-torn Europe, arrives in New York, and encounters a radically new environment. In 1942 and 1943, he paints Broadway Boogie-Woogie.
Which is a massive departure from his stark black and white grids in Europe.
Here, we have a grid of intersecting yellow lines, punctuated with small blocks of pure red, blue, and gray. The title is not just an afterthought, it is the literal operating system of the painting. Mondrian was obsessed with the jazz clubs of New York, and he explicitly translated urban rhythm and jazz pulse into colored blocks.
He was trying to paint the sound of the city.
But let's talk about the mechanics of how human sight actually works here. We don't take in a canvas all at once like a camera lens opening and closing. The human eye moves in rapid, jerky jumps called saccades. We build our understanding of a visual field sequentially.
Our eyes have to physically travel across the object.
Mondrian understood this intuitively. When he lays down those long, uninterrupted yellow lines, he is creating a predictable pathway for your optic nerve. Your brain recognizes the pattern and relaxes into the rhythm. But then, right where your mind expects another segment of yellow, he drops in a sharp, high-contrast block of pure cadmium red.
Which forces the eye to stop.
What happens neurologically? Your eye literally stutters. The expectation is broken. The processing time micro-delays. That physical stutter in your eye's movement is the exact visual equivalent of an offbeat in jazz. The canvas works by syncopation.
That is a very literal translation of rhythm.
There are visual beats, pauses, accents, and momentum. Your eye dances across the canvas in a rhythmic time signature. The painting proves that music furnished the exact grammatical structure by which the visual elements organize themselves. Mondrian didn't just paint something that vaguely looked like music. He engineered a canvas to mechanically behave like music.
You are describing the mechanical process of sight beautifully, but we must challenge the ontology of this claim by looking at the fundamental physics of the mediums you are comparing.
The physics?
Yes, music and painting simply do not exist in the same dimensional reality. Music is inextricably bound to time. It must unfold sequentially. You cannot hear an entire Beethoven symphony in a single second. You must subject yourself to its duration.
Whereas a painting is fully present.
A painting exists entirely at once in space. When you stand before Broadway Boogie-Woogie, the entire data set is physically available to your optic nerve simultaneously.
Your eye may track across it over time through those saccades you mentioned, but the object itself is static.
I don't see how that diminishes the structural borrowing.
Because of this inescapable physical difference, visual rhythm is a deeply fruitful analogy, but it is still just an analogy. To confuse analogy with origin is to mistake resemblance for cause. Furthermore, tracing this solely through a Western European lineage of modernism reveals a distinct cultural parochialism.
You're saying we are ignoring the rest of the globe.
Long before European painters discovered abstraction through jazz or symphonies, non-Western traditions possessed sophisticated non-mimetic visual vocabularies. Consider the Japanese concept of ma,
The charged interval?
the meaningful emptiness in spatial arrangement. It is the understanding that the empty space between two objects is just as structurally important as the objects themselves. Or consider the vast, complex geometric traditions of Islamic pattern making.
Which rely heavily on mathematics.
They organize architectural space through profound mathematical harmony, without representing a single human figure. These traditions didn't need a symphony to teach them how to organize space. The principles of rhythm, balance, and interval are universal visual tools, not musical exports that Europe invented in the 20th century.
I am absolutely willing to acknowledge that the physics of the mediums differ fundamentally in time and space. And yes, global visual traditions are vital context. But let's look at what happens when those distinct mediums target the exact same physiological and cognitive mechanisms in the human brain.
You want to talk about perception.
If we transition to the 1960s, the minimalists' threshold, we see a culmination of this shared project that goes far beyond mere resemblance. It becomes a shared science of perception. Let's compare two revolutionary works from this era.
Okay, who are we looking at?
In sound, we have Steve Reich's 1965 composition, It's Gonna Rain. Let's break down the mechanics of what Reich actually built. He takes a recording of a street preacher shouting, "It's gonna rain." He cuts that tape into two identical loops.
Magnetic tape on reel-to-reel decks.
He puts them on two separate tape decks and presses play at the exact same time. At first, they are perfectly in unison. It sounds like one voice. But the physical capstan motors of those tape decks are infinitesimally different. One is spinning a fraction of a millimeter faster than the other.
So they slowly slip out of phase.
Slowly, over minutes, the two identical loops begin to drift. First, you get a slight echo, then a harsh, metallic reverberation. Then the words break apart entirely into a chaotic wash of pure percussive noise. The listener is subjected to a profound psychological event just by tracking the minute variation of a repeating pattern.
It is a grueling, fascinating listening experience.
Now, transition that exact same mechanism to the visual world with Agnes Martin in the same decade. She takes a massive 6-foot by 6-foot canvas. She paints it a flat, serene gesso white. Then, using a ruler and a graphite pencil, she draws hundreds of microscopic, perfectly spaced horizontal and vertical lines.
A massive grid.
A grid. From 10 feet away, the canvas looks entirely blank. But as you walk closer, the pattern reveals itself. And here is the crucial mechanism. Because she drew it by hand, the pencil skips slightly over the tooth of the canvas. The pressure of her hand varies imperceptibly.
The human flaw in the machine.
On the surface, magnetic tape loops and graphite grids have nothing in common. Yet, both artists discovered an identical high-yield formula for creating aesthetic intensity by severely limiting their material. Repetition is not redundancy when variation is microscopic.
That is a fascinating way to phrase it.
When you listen to Reich, the repetition becomes a stable ground, and the minute phasing of the tapes becomes a seismic emotional event. When you stare at an Agnes Martin grid, the repetitive structure calms the eye, but the slight tremble of her hand creates immense emotional charge. Both forms make the pattern stable enough to orient the perceiver, and then disturb it, just enough to keep consciousness awake.
You're saying the physiological effect is identical.
That shared physiological effect proves that music and abstract art are fundamentally utilizing the exact same perceptual mechanics.
They absolutely utilize the same perceptual mechanics. I don't disagree with the neurology of what you just laid out at all. But, you are drawing the wrong conclusion from that fact.
How so? The shared mechanics seem like undeniable proof.
Let's deploy a biological framework here to explain why. Think of a bat and a bird. If you just look at the surface, the wings, you would say, they come from the exact same family. They both can fly, they both rely on aerodynamic principles to generate lift, they both have structures that look and function similarly.
Right, they both navigate the air.
That is what you are doing with music and painting. You are looking at the wings, but biologically, completely different evolutionary trees. A bat is a mammal and a bird is an avian dinosaur. Their wings don't mean they share the same evolutionary path.
They are an example of convergent evolution.
Exactly. Convergent evolution. Two separate species facing the exact same environmental problem, the need to navigate the air, and arriving at similar physical solutions entirely independently. Steve Reich and Agnes Martin didn't share a direct lineage.
You don't think they were influencing each other?
Martin wasn't painting her delicate graphite grids because she was listening to experimental phase music, and Reich wasn't cutting tape loops because he was staring at minimalist canvases. They both, independently, discovered universal features of human pattern perception.
Which is that we are wired to notice anomalies.
We are biologically wired as a species to notice recurrence and to detect deviation against a stable background. That is how we survive in the wild. We look for the break in the pattern, the rustle in the leaves that breaks the wind's rhythm. The fact that minimalist music and minimalist painting both exploit this neurological quirk doesn't mean one birthed the other. It means both mediums finally stripped away enough historical baggage to touch the bedrock of human cognition at the exact same time.
I appreciate the evolutionary biological metaphor, but, your convergent evolution argument forces us to ignore the sheer volume of artists who explicitly cite music as their bridge. It is tough to say they evolved completely independently when the painters themselves are constantly referencing the musicians.
They shared a cultural vocabulary, yes. However, I will concede a crucial point to your biological framing. Kandinsky's synesthesia was an individual neurological bridge. It was his specific truth, not a universal neurological rule applied to all painters. And I must acknowledge the undeniable weight of the other forces you've outlined.
The camera, the physics, the global traditions. Yes, the camera rendering mimetic painting redundant, the physics community revealing an invisible world, and the rich legacy of non-Western spatial organization. Looking at the modern audiovisual reality we inhabit today, we see artists routinely composing environments where number becomes image, where a digital image translates instantly into a sonic pulse, and where that pulse becomes sound.
The digital era has completely flattened those boundaries.
The old hierarchy collapses into fusion. The fact that these forms map onto each other so flawlessly today suggests that the musical analogy of the early 20th century was prophetic. But absorbing your pushback on Malevich as absolute zero and the concept of convergent evolution, I arrive at a definitive realization. Abstraction had more than one road into existence. From the very start, music was not the only road, but for a critical mass of artists, it was the most loudly illuminated one.
And I will gladly meet you at that synthesis. I concede that while music wasn't the sole engine of abstraction, it was absolutely the nearest working prototype.
It gave them the language they needed.
It was the most socially legible example of this new, non-mimetic world. When a painter was trying to convince a skeptical public, and honestly themselves, that a canvas of shapes and colors had immense cultural value, pointing to a Beethoven symphony was the most effective defense available. It provided necessary cultural cover while the visual arts found their new footing.
So we arrive at a rather elegant middle ground.
We can arrive at a sophisticated shared verdict here. Abstract art and music are not a parent and child. They are co-beneficiaries of a modern society that learned to trust structures over surface appearances. They both grew up in an era that realized truth doesn't always look like the literal object it describes.
They both found a way to map the invisible.
But as our current technology continues to seamlessly fuse data, light, and sound into singular immersive installations, I am left with a final forward-looking question for anyone interacting with art today. As the boundaries between seeing and hearing completely dissolve in the digital realm, what new abstract grammar will our minds be forced to learn next?
This is the research desk officially signing off.